Well, let me just start with this is for our lay audience, shall I say the least. This is where the Kingdom of Congo is located. And this is a little bit more detailed map of the country, um, which is just to show you that it was large and fairly complicated. Okay, so what I want to begin with is to talk a little bit about the conversion of the Kingdom of Congo to Christianity. First of all, because unfortunately, a longstanding historiography has sort of made this a project of Portugal and given Portugal a lot of the credit for that, which is largely because of the Portuguese historiography. In fact, it's quite a different situation. It really is much more of what we like to think of as self-evangelization effort. Portugal made contact with Congo in 1482, as we know, and after an exchange of somewhat awkward exchange of visitors, Congo sent a formal mission to Lisbon in 1486. This was led by a man whose name I've reconstructed as Kalkamfusu. They stayed in Lisbon for a little bit less than 4 years. During that time, they lodged in a church in Lisbon. They mingled quite freely with the Portuguese population. They brought with them both adults and also older children with the intention of making a bilingual community. And they studied with a man named a Portuguese priest named Vicente dos Anjos, who learned their language and taught them his. And in the process of doing that, I think they hammered out the first sort of understanding of what Congo Christianity would be like through the act of translation or the science of language. And so what we get from this is a medieval form of Christianity. I want to stress that medieval component because this is pre-Reformation, pre-Counter-Reformation, and it lodged in a much more broadly defined concept of Christianity. As we know from the Counter-Reformation testimony on Portuguese religion, and what the Inquisition was exploring was a much wider set of spiritual figures that were not necessarily deemed to be diabolic. And so there was lots of sort of local forms of revelation that brought in things that weren't necessarily part of what we would think of as standard Christianity. And this was sort of what they learned in Portugal as well. So there was probably not as much finishing around about exactly how much of Congolese religion would be entering into the new state. Okay, so subsequent to that, they then returned to Congo, and this is when the sort of evangelization started. One of the things we have to say immediately about the evangelization of Congo is that it wasn't also really very much in the hands of Portuguese missionaries, for the simple reason that there were very few Portuguese missionaries that went there. I don't think there was a time in Congo's history when there were more than 10 or 15 missionaries in the entire country. Most of those missionaries devoted themselves, first of all, to teaching, but then ultimately, because Christianity requires the performance of sacraments, the delivery of the sacraments. And that delivery of the sacraments ended up being sort of ruinous for the missionary efforts because as Congo's Christianity developed, they were required to engage in endless long-scale travels over the country to baptize, 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 and baptize. A report of 1623 tells us that 6 priests were responsible for 40,000 baptisms a year. So this doesn't leave a lot of room, obviously, for the Portuguese to impose any sort of Christianity on Congo. And in fact, the task of doing that lay to these people, who were called in the European language documents mestres de escola, or school teachers. We see them all over the place. They're frequently mentioned in texts. They're called ndongaleke and kikongo, as we know from the Catechism. These were the real teachers of Christianity in Congo. And we start hearing about them in the 15 teens. By 1540s, they're spread all over the countryside. They were typically drawn from the nobility of the country. They were literate, and they were sort of the educational political elite. And so what exactly did they bring with them? Well, first of all, they were more or less tolerant of many local religious practices. So if we can imagine that Congo's religion prior to the Christian period was like many other African traditional religions. For example, a good model of that would be the religion of Luango, a Kikongo-speaking country, but was not a Christian country laying to the north. We know that the propitiation of ancestors was a very important part of religious life, that when somebody died, they didn't necessarily leave the world and go somewhere else, but they remained present in a spiritual way to assist their descendants. This was a big and important component in Congolese religion. The second thing was that they had higher level spiritual entities, which may or may not have been somebody's ancient ancestor. Again, because Congolese religion was continuously revealed, there wasn't a whole lot of necessary consensus on exactly how the cosmology was organized. We have lots of people today trying to create Congo cosmologies, but I think in the past, this was not a matter that greatly concerned them. There were lots of opinions that were varied. We don't hear people being charged with incorrect ideas of the cosmos. So the second body of spiritual entities were what I would like to call territorial entities. They tended to be powerful. They tended to be not particularly swayed by individual persons' attitudes or ideas, and they were sort of deliverers of justice and so on. They tended to reside in rocky hillsides, forests, and places like that. Often they're called Nkita. And then there was a third category of entities which were minor in terms of their power and capacity, but the kind that could be manipulated. And these, again, might be ancestral spirits, but more likely than not, they were simply ones found in nature. They could be incorporated into an object. Typically, these objects were what the Europeans called fetishes, and what we've been talking about before in Cecile's talk in particular. So one of the ways or another, you either capture or persuade an entity to go into your physical object. And so this is sort of the lay of the land. Now, basically, the Mestre Escola didn't really interfere with that. On occasion, because it might be misused as witchcraft, they would intervene. And a lot of what we think of as sort of the campaigns to destroy witchcraft in Congo were, when the Europeans were talking about them, they're thinking about, cleansing the body politic. But in fact, what they're really doing is dealing with this person, this particular case. Here we have misuse of spiritual forces. And so this is sort of the way that Congo was going to take over the control of its religion. Now, what exactly did they come up with it from this? This was sort of an interesting prospect. So first of all, we can say what would be brought into Congo religion from Christianity, and the best way of looking at that is to look at the text of the Catechism. So the earliest catechism that we know existed was written in the middle of the 16th century. Unfortunately, there's no extant version of that, so we don't know what its text was. So we have to deal with the Catechism of 1624. Now, according to that catechism's introduction, the editor of it was Mateus Cardoso, a Jesuit priest, who attributes the translation to the most learned masters of the Congolese court. We know one of those men was Feliz de Espírito Santo, who was a high-ranking noble. At one point, he held the title of duke, and he was obviously a literate and friend of Capuchin missionaries and Jesuit missionaries, during that period. He also, Mateus Cardoso, also tells us that the Congolese had some traditional terms which he took issue with, which tells us that, first of all, that there was an existing interpretation of Christianity and that this catechism was intended to address some problems that the Jesuits had with that. The one that he mentions in particular was he didn't like the idea that the Trinity, the three members of the Trinity were called humans, Antu. He thought that didn't fully represent what the three items of the divine nature of these entities wasn't well defined by that term. So he thought he should change that. He wasn't real fond of the idea of kudamingwa, to eat salt, as a term for baptism, and there were some other things that he quibbled about. Actually, as far as we can tell, even within the text, sometimes those words still creep in. So he wasn't quite as successful in rooting it out as he wanted to be. My point here being that really the Catechism has a lot to say that's basically informed in its vocabulary by the religious concepts of Kongo. Okay. The other thing that's interesting about it is that it was a translation of Marcos Jorge's catechism, which was designed for a Portuguese audience. The assumption of that catechism is that the student who's learning the catechism is already and entirely a Christian. And so there's lots of things that are just taken for granted. It's interesting to say this because the catechism that was designed for Angola, the Portuguese colony, actually has a section which is dedicated to denouncing a whole wide range of Kimbundu deities and local territorial spirits, as these were things that were wicked and not to be done. And there is a certain attitude by the same, as a Jesuit authored one as well, the same attitude that you might expect in the Counter-Reformation. But that's absolutely absent from the Kikongo Catechism. There's nothing that's denouncing anything that's part of the Congolese tradition. Of course, there's denunciation of sin, but the sin is never defined in that way. There's no talk of witchcraft or anything like that. All right, so the Catechism is pretty straightforward. It gives you what you would expect as the sort of standard procedure for Christian religion, a definition of the members of the Trinity, the saints. It tells us, for example, how to make the sign of the cross, the typical prayers of the church, Hail Mary, Hail Holy Queen, and the Apostles' Creed, those kinds of things, all there, presumably to be memorized. And we know that they talk about one God in three parts. They have a little explanation of that, the ideas of heaven and hell. There's actually not much difference between, they use the term bulungu for hell, but bulungu is a sort of a place of punishment. I think the interesting thing about the way in which ancestor worship fits into the question of salvation, so much that the ancestors can't continue to intervene, but they intervene from wherever they are. So they might be in heaven, they might be in hell, they might be in purgatory, but however that might be, they're still available here. I think that's a reinterpretation that they did for that. Okay, so so far what you can see is that you can continue pretty much with the existing African traditional religion with all of its features. That doesn't have to be interfered with. And on that, you've sort of planted a layer on the top, which defines the saints and the Holy Trinity. Now, the next thing that happens along the way is that the saints begin arriving in Congo. That is to say, they're not taught that the saints arrive, but that the saints co-reveal. So we have instances in which a particular saint will appear in some place, or there'll be a place which is known to have spiritual components in which suddenly we discover all along this has been a saint. And so it's sort of a discovery of, oh, we've had saints here all along, which then brings us to the next component of this process. Now, here's the Capuchin missionary burning what he calls a fetish. This was a lot of what Capuchins did. The Capuchins really brought the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation into Congo. And their writing about it very strongly emphasizes the witchcraft component, as they understood it, of all these various local traditions. They were tolerated in doing this because the Congolese desperately needed and wanted to have priests. They wanted to have people that perform the sacraments. They really truly believed in the sacraments. The fact that we see so many thousands of people baptized, the priests never have difficulty getting around. Everybody comes and presents themselves. When they do, they sing the right songs, they say the right prayers. But there's this awkward witchcraft thing. And unfortunately, the Capuchin writing, which is very, very extensive, thousands of pages of testimony about Congo, give you the impression that this is a highly defective religion. I should add, though, that if you read the accounts of the Counter-Reformation in Europe, almost the same language is employed. They talk about sort of diabolic influences. They talk about superstition and idolatry in Europe while they're denouncing the medieval church. So here it's just the same medieval church, except it's in Africa. And this burning of fetishes and so on has done that. What its impact has been on the historiography is to give us an impression of a relatively shallow and superficial understanding of Christianity, when what we really have is a local understanding of Christianity. This figure will make sense for you in a minute. So the next thing that Congos did in the 16th century was they nationalized the religion in a way that made it very much a part of Congo. So the story on this is pretty simple. In 1541, Alfonso sent his brother Manuel to go to Europe to visit the Pope. He was very concerned. There was a new Pope, and he wanted to make obedience to that Pope. And he was very concerned that the previous Pope had denied Congo the right to have a bishop who would then reside in the country. They wanted to have a fully fledged church under the patronage of the Kingdom of Congo. And the Portuguese had sort of stolen that away from him by allowing them to have a bishop, but it had to be a Portuguese bishop and it had to be responsible to the King of Portugal. And this created a tremendous problem. So one of the tasks of Manuel was to try to straighten that out if he could. And so on his way to Rome, he never actually made it to Rome, unfortunately. But on his way, he stopped at the Church of Our Lady of Guadalupe in southern Spain. When he came to the church, he was given to understand that the statue of the Virgin in that church was painted by the Apostle Luke. That's the painting on which it's based, was painted by the Apostle Luke from life because he knew the Virgin himself. And this painting was a famous painting, was well known in Europe. And when he comes to see the representation in Guadalupe, what does he see but this image? So as it happens, the Virgin in Guadalupe is one of the Black Madonnas, of which there's a great number in Europe. And various explanations have been offered for how they are. And apparently many Europeans had Black Madonnas and they didn't think much of it. But in this particular case, I think that a Congolese visitor would have been quite surprised and perhaps, I think, greatly pleased to see Jesus and Mary as Black as they're shown here. This is the actual Virgin as she looks. And not surprisingly, Manuel left a lamp dedicated there, which a Portuguese pilgrim saw 3 years later. Subsequently, Diogo I, in 1555, made a more formal donation to the church at Guadalupe, giving a larger lamp and establishing a foundation for its support. Later still, Alvaro I sent to Rome to ask to have a copy of the painting of the Virgin by the Apostle Luke, done from life. That particular painting actually shows a white Virgin, the one in Rome, not a Black Virgin. I don't know whether that version ever made it to Portugal or to Congo or not, but it was enough, I think, to establish this idea that somehow the maternity story, the nativity story, is one that involves African actors. The second thing that comes out of this early experience was the understanding of the location of the Garden of Eden. So here you see an early 16th century Portuguese map of Africa. And if you look on the top fragment, you'll see Rio de Mani Congo. That's the Congo River. Very soon, Portuguese came to identify the Congo River as being one of the 4 rivers that flowed out of the Garden of Eden as described in the book of Genesis. Even as early as 1512, there was already an interest by Portugal to explore up the Congo River in the hopes of finding one of the lakes, a famous lake from which the Nile emerged, but also the Congo River. So when you plotted this on a European map, given their knowledge of the geography of Africa, which was limited, they put the Garden of Eden, as you can see, this is the Garden of Eden, right smack where the Kingdom of Congo, where the River Congo comes. It's not very difficult to assume then that the Congolese naturally, on the basis of this type of information, concluded that, in fact, God had created humanity in Central Africa. When the Capuchins came to Congo, they found this a very deeply entrenched idea. Giovanni Antonio Cavazzi, one of the missionaries, wrote somewhat scoffingly that the Congolese believed that when God created the world, he sent his angels and ministers out to create everywhere else so that he could devote his singular attention to the Kingdom of Congo. When Alvaro was receiving a Portuguese mission in 1583, he casually commented on them after a discussion that the fig tree in the Garden of Eden was actually in Safu. That's one of the trees of Central African tree that bears a special fruit, and the Safu fruit is supposed to have the image of the cross in it if you look at it carefully in the right way. And so he sort of says, well, okay, this would make sense. So what we're done with at the end of this was, okay, God created the earth in Central Africa. Mary and Jesus were Black. the Congos were still troubled more by this situation. They also wanted to say, well, um, what about Christianity? How is it that we didn't have Christianity? Well, lo and behold, by the 1580s, we were already hearing that the Congos had been Christian. The Apostle Thomas had visited Congo in the early apostolic period. The idea of St. Thomas traveling around all over the place, this is an idea that originated in Europe. Already in the 15 teens, we were hearing that St. Thomas had visited America, that the various American religions which had what relationship or whatever to Christianity was ascribed to the preaching of the Apostle Thomas. Well, here we have it. The Congos take this up. Aha, there we go. And they discovered that the caves in Louvo, in the mountain north of the country, there were these mysterious engravings, which they presumed to be the work of this Apostle Thomas. So now we have them, not only are they sort of the whole creation and nativity story is African, but on top of that, we also have them being Christian, and then somehow they sort of drifted away, and the Portuguese reminded them, I guess is the best way of putting it. Okay, so what I hope we get from this is what are the Congolese now going to bring with them when they go off to be a part of the diaspora? And the first is that we would have to say this is a relatively Afrocentric concept of Christianity. They're not really looking at the white man's religion exactly, nor would they have seen of it that way. And we know, for example, from the possessed testimony of Donna Beatriz Quimpavita in 1704, she has the whole story laid out with African actors in Africa and so on. When that was first published back in the 1960s, people thought it was a creation of that time and that it was simply something that a possessed virgin had to say. But in fact, what we see now is that she's really maybe modifying or maybe just reinterpreting what everybody sort of thought they knew. And making that clear. And much of her teaching is sort of against the idea that the missionaries were not letting them have black saints when they knew that the saints were black. And so this is where it works. Okay, so in the 16th century and the 17th century, Congo was not a big participant in the slave trade with its own people. Primarily, as far as we can tell, they were the slaves that were exported from Congo in the 16th century were mostly from external sources. But Congo had an issue, which was the highly, I would say, over-centralized nature of its government, so that every time a king died, there was likely to be a ferocious civil war over who would be the next king. And these civil wars were probably the primary source of exports of Congolese slaves in the 17th century. We know there was a very difficult and long-lasting time between the death of Alvaro II in 1614 and the advent of Alfonso V in 1636. There's like a 30-year period when they're citing a lot of civil wars. The documentation is dense enough on this that we were able to actually identify, Linda Haywood and I, when we wrote our book on the first generation of Africans in the Americas, we pointed out that this long series of civil wars would have brought Congolese from the center of the kingdom out into being enslaved. And so we start finding a lot of Congos in that. More important than that, after 1665, the Civil War process became unresolved. And gradually the country first divided into rival camps of would-be kings, and then subsequently the emergence of a new category of what I call entrepreneurial nobles. These were people that were taking advantage of the disorder and the collapse of central organs of state and creating sort of little micro communities for themselves. The most famous of these people was a man that we only know as Mboilau, or Mad Dog. I thought that Mad Dog, who's described in a document of 1780s, was sort of a unique feature. But then when I started looking at Congo traditions, I saw, wait a minute, Mboilau occurs in a number of them. And so apparently this is actually a generic term for the kind of what I call entrepreneurial noble. These are people who build an estate for themselves. They build a fortified location, and then they send out soldiers to gather the population, and those people are then made part of their new sort of little territory. If they become strong enough, they'll get a knightship in the Order of Christ from the king. But in the process, thousands of people are exported as slaves. And so this particular period, especially after about 1710 or so, it's Congolese from the central part of the country that are exported. Important to keep this in mind because I don't want to pretend that this group is not somehow present in the Americas. Now, what exactly do they bring with them? Well, First of all, of course, they bring with them basic knowledge of Christianity, the idea of the Holy Trinity, the saints, prayers, and those kind of things that are all there, making the sign of the cross and that sort of thing. And when they go to Catholic countries, they simply fit in. There's no special thing for them when they arrive in Brazil or when they arrive in Hispaniola. Here's a church, there's the songs, they just drop in. Nobody notices them. And I must say that in Brazil, Angolans were noted, and Angola was tended to be used generically for the whole region, but it also, of course, included people who had been missionized by the Portuguese in Angola, the colony to the south of Congo. So that would be a group. They were simply brought in and considered Christians no problem. In fact, there's an interesting account where the Minas, who were not from a Christian area, were complaining that they were just as good as the Angolans as Christians. But they had to work harder at it. And I think this is why we don't see much about problems, so to speak, with them, except, of course, that they still brought with them the idea that you could locate spirits in nature and other kinds of things that could help you with your troubles, and that your ancestors were still valuable. They still brought that with them as well. If they get in trouble, it's often for that kind of thing. But more to the point, they actually brought with them their own people. Mestres de Scola, perhaps. So in Protestant America, it's a different story. There's two things that are problems in Protestant America. The first is that there's tremendous resistance throughout Protestant America to even evangelizing the slaves at all. The idea that if a person became a Christian, they could no longer be a slave was actually well entrenched, and therefore something that masters didn't want to deal with. And so they actively oppose this. So consequently, the Africans from all over the other parts of Africa, when they come to the Americas, they're not going to hear much about Christianity except by the side from their masters, but they might very well hear it from Congos. So this is a picture of Georg Andreas Oldendorp. He was a Moravian missionary working in the Virgin Islands. He wrote a very large and detailed book about the life of slaves in his country, and he tells us about the fact that the Congos who came to the Virgin Islands, at least, routinely baptized the newly arrived people, taught them simple songs, put salt in their mouth, kudamungwa, to eat salt, and gave them a slap on the face for their sins that they committed in Guinea, and subsequently became their godparents. He says this wasn't just once or twice, but he knew several different people who were doing this. And this is an interesting sort of discourse. Of course, I think, well, it's the Virgin Islands, it's Danish, he's German. Maybe this is just a bizarre thing that happened there. Except the problem is that so many Protestant countries, in English-speaking in particular, there's so little information about anything religious going on with the slaves, or even anything about their lives, that it's very hard to tell whether this wasn't going on elsewhere, say in the Low Countries or someplace else. We can't say. We do know that, generally speaking, Africans did not put up much resistance to becoming Christians. If anything, they were prevented from becoming Christians by the policies of the masters. So this Oldendorp example, while it's only an example and can't be generalized too much, I think does have some possibilities for considering the idea that Congolese are actually evangelizing. Interestingly enough, we have Congolese evangelization even taking place in Brazil. An Inquisition case along the way tells us that there was a man named Pedro Kongo who was accused by the Inquisition. Actually, he never came to the Inquisition. He was only investigated, and apparently he never went to trial. That he was dressing up in ecclesiastical garb and teaching Minas, that is to say, people from the non-Christian part of Africa and Brazil, teaching them Christian precepts. And that the Portuguese who had seen this going on, they were saying, well, what's this guy about? And so there was some questions about him. As far as we know, that's as far as it went. But again, we can imagine that this evangelization process is not something that necessarily would not stop when people came across the ocean. For that same purpose, we have the possibility that these people were masters. Oldendorp thought that the people he knew in the Virgin Islands who were doing this were actually priests in Africa. He knew that the Jesuits, they always thought the Jesuits did this. The Jesuits had a church there, and they'd probably taught them, and that's how they came to be able to do what they were doing. Well, I don't think that's necessarily the whole story. I want also just to make as one last sort of thing before I stop my presentation, um, that it was interesting that I recently discovered in an Inquisition case from Brazil the mechanism by which the gods of the region around Dahomey came to Brazil was through an interesting process. It doesn't involve the Congolese, but it does involve the Christian church, which is to say, well, how exactly do you bring a god from Africa over to the Americas? And the answer apparently is, at least according to this Inquisition case from 1747, that Our Lady of the Rosary, an important lay brotherhood that many Africans belong to, Our Lady of the Rosary had an understanding that that the Virgin herself had gone to Jesus and for 7 years on her knees had begged him to allow the Minas to have the saint of their country, Santo de seu Pai, to come to their country. And finally, the Virgin had persuaded Jesus to allow that to happen, and so the saint was brought in, and the Inquisition case refers to a possession by that particular saint, in this case, a fallen god, was the case for the point in case. Actually, the Brotherhood had received a letter from God addressing the Pope, explaining that it was permissible to have the saint come there. The bishop didn't think so much of that, and he had it torn down on 3 different occasions. So I want to just terminate my discussion here by saying that I hope that we can understand that, first of all, the Christianity of the Kingdom of Congo, while it might be perceived as irregular from the outside, was very much of a Christian community. Certainly in terms of the liturgical aspects of their understanding of life, they were very much a Christian community, and they had a very strong sense of Christian identity. That identity had been transferred from Europe to Africa, thanks to the events of the 16th century, so that they didn't have a sense that this was something that was alien to Africa or alien to them. Presumably, they could bring that with them to the Americas. Again, some of my hopes and discovery about this will be speculative because of the absence of documentation, but I think where we have documentation and where we can show documentation is valuable to try to do that. So I want to thank you all for your attention, and I will stop my share.